The dust hung red in the evening air when Callum Hayes rode into Perdition Creek. His mare's hooves kicked up little clouds that settled on everything: the warped boardwalk, the peeling paint of storefronts, the shoulders of men who didn't bother brushing it off anymore. The town had that look about it, like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded, waiting to disappear entirely. The Quiet Star Saloon stood out only because its windows glowed earlier than the others. Not brighter, just sooner, as if the proprietor understood that darkness came to some places before the sun actually set. Callum tied his mare to the post, fingers working the leather with the careful movements of a man who'd learned not to rush anything. The reins were worn smooth where his hands always gripped them. 3 months of fence work at the Garrison Ranch had put money in his pocket, but the foreman's narrow looks had told him it was time to move on. Men who asked no questions were useful only until they became familiar. The saloon door swung on hinges that had been recently oiled. Inside, the air was thick with lamp smoke and the smell of sawdust that had absorbed too many spills. A piano sat in the corner like a 3-legged dog. Keys yellowed and chipped. Nobody was playing it. The woman behind the bar wore a gray dress that had been mended with careful stitches. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was pinned up in a style that suggested she'd once lived somewhere that cared about such things. She wore gloves despite the heat, dark leather that came past her wrists. "Whiskey?" she asked, without looking up from the glass she was polishing. "Water first, if you have it." That made her look. Her eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain. Man who asks for water before whiskey is either sick, religious, or running from something. Or maybe just thirsty. She set a glass of water on the bar. Her movements were precise, economical. Callum noticed she was careful not to let her gloved fingers touch his when he reached for it. The water tasted of minerals and distance, drawn from deep places. He drank slowly, aware of her watching him. The other patrons, 2 old miners at a corner table. A traveling merchant nursing a beer paid him the courtesy of indifference. That's when the trouble walked in. 3 ranch hands, young and loud with payday courage. They pushed through the door like they owned the place, bringing the smell of cattle and unwashed pride with them. "May Delaney," the tallest one called out, his voice sharp with liquor taken elsewhere. "We come to collect what's owed." The woman May set down her polishing cloth with deliberate calm. "You boys are confused. You don't work for me, and I don't owe you anything. Your girl Ruby does. Promised us a dance last week, then ran off with that drummer from Kansas City. Ruby left my employ 6 days ago. What she promised you is between you and the wind now." The tall one's face darkened. He started forward, boot heels heavy on the floorboards. His companions flanked him, hands drifting toward their belts in that casual way men did when they wanted you to remember they were armed. Callum's fingers tightened on his water glass. His Colt sat heavy on his hip, but he'd learned the hard way that being quick with a gun just meant being quick to regret. Still, 3 against 1 woman stuck in his throat like a fishbone. May didn't back up, didn't even straighten. She simply reached below the bar and pulled out a mop handle, no mop attached, just the smooth, worn wood. "Tommy Bracken," she said to the tall one, voice steady as bedrock. "Your mother brings her eggs here every Tuesday, trades them for coffee and flour because your father drinks away the cash money. You want me to tell her why she'll have to find another place to trade?" The ranch hand stopped. His face went through several colors. "And you, Marcus Wells," she continued, pointing the mop handle at the man on the left. "I wrote that letter to the judge in Amarillo about your brother. Got his sentence reduced from 5 years to 2. You planning to make me regret that kindness?" Marcus's hand fell away from his belt. She turned to the third man. "Bobby Sullivan. Your little sister Annie comes here after school. I teach her to read while her mother takes in washing. You want to be the reason that stops?" The silence stretched taut as fence wire. Callum watched it all from his place at the bar, seeing how she'd mapped out the entire confrontation before it began. No threats, no raised voice, just the careful application of knowledge, like a surgeon working with a very sharp knife. Tommy Bracken worked his jaw like he was chewing something bitter. "This ain't over." "It never is," May replied. "But it is for tonight." They left, their departure as loud as their arrival, but somehow diminished. The merchant at his table let out a breath he'd been holding. The two miners went back to their cards. May put the mop handle away and returned to polishing glasses as if nothing had happened. But Callum caught the slight tremor in her hands, quickly suppressed. "That was well done," he said. "It was necessary." She didn't look at him. "This town has enough violence. I won't add to it if I can help it. Most saloon owners I've known would have pulled a shotgun. Most saloon owners are men." She held up a glass to the lamplight, checking for spots. "I can't afford to solve problems the same way." Callum finished his water and set a coin on the bar. As he turned to leave, something made him look toward the door. Through the window, he could see a shape moving in the shadows across the street. Someone was nailing something to the post outside. May saw it too. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the first sign of weariness he'd witnessed. She walked to the door with that same measured pace, Callum following out of curiosity more than chivalry. The wooden sign was crude, the letters burned in with hasty strokes, "Town Filth." May stood looking at it for a long moment. The evening wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain that would probably never arrive. Without a word, she reached up and pulled the sign free, the nails squealing as they came loose from the wood. She tucked it under her arm and walked back inside. Callum remained on the boardwalk, studying the post where the sign had been. This wasn't the first time, he realized. The wood was pocked with old nail holes, some rusty with age. How many signs had she pulled down? How many nights had she done this, quiet and alone? When he went back inside, she was feeding the sign to the pot-bellied stove in the corner. The flames took it eagerly, reducing hate to ash in moments. "You need a hired man." The words came out before Callum could think better of them. May looked up from the stove. "I can't pay much. Room and board would do. I'm handy with repairs." She studied him then, really looked at him for the first time. He wondered what she saw, another drifter, probably, saddle-worn and sun-cured, carrying his mistakes in the slump of his shoulders. But something in her expression shifted, like a door opening just a crack. "There's a room above the stable. Roof leaks when it rains." "I can fix that." "I imagine you can." She closed the stove door and returned to the bar. "2 rules. No fighting unless there's no choice. And keep your hands clean. Don't touch me or any of the girls who work here without permission." The second rule hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Callum nodded. "Fair enough. Then you can start tomorrow. Kitchen opens at 6 for the miners heading to first shift. You'll help Cookie with the heavy work." He turned to leave again, then stopped. "Those boys will be back." "They always come back." May poured herself a small glass of water from the same pitcher she'd served him from. "But most of them learn. Eventually. This town's too small for everyone to stay enemies." Outside, full dark had settled over Perdition Creek. Callum led his mare to the stable, finding the room May had mentioned barely more than a loft with a cot and a washstand. The roof did indeed leak, evidenced by the water stains on the floorboards, but it was clean, and it was quiet. And for now, that was enough. As he unsaddled his horse, he thought about May Delaney standing in her saloon, armed with nothing but knowledge and a mop handle. He thought about the careful distance she maintained, the gloves she never removed, the sign she'd burned without comment or complaint. Perdition Creek might be dying, but something in the quiet star was still fighting to live. And Callum Hayes, who'd been running from his own ghosts for 3 years, found himself wanting to know what that something was. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards of the stable. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and below his feet, so faint he might have imagined it, came the sound of water moving through hidden places. Waiting. The red notice appeared on a Tuesday night, when the moon was new and the street lamps burned low on oil. Callum had been working at the Quiet Star for a week, long enough to learn the rhythms of the place when the miners came for their morning coffee, when the ranch hands drifted in after sundown, when May counted the till and locked the cash box in the safe behind the bar. He was sweeping the back steps when he heard the hammering, 3 sharp strikes of metal on wood, echoing off the silent storefronts. By the time he rounded the building, whoever had done it was gone, leaving only boot prints in the dust and the smell of fresh ink. The notice was printed on official paper, heavy and cream-colored, with the seal of the Railroad Land Company embossed at the top. Abandonment of claim. It read in letters designed to intimidate. Below, in smaller print, the details that turned May's property into a target. Callum pulled it down and brought it inside. May was wiping down tables, her movement steady despite the late hour. She looked up when he entered, saw the paper in his hand, and something in her face closed like a shutter. "Let me see it." He handed it over. She read it once, then again, her gloved fingers tightening on the edges. "They're getting bolder," she said finally. "Usually they wait a month between notices." "This happen often?" "Often enough." She folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. "The Railroad Land Company claims they have prior rights to any property with access to underground water sources. They've been buying up claims all along the creek." "But you're not selling." "No." The word came out flat. Final. "I'm not." Before Callum could ask why, a crash came from the kitchen. They both turned toward the sound. Through the doorway, Callum could see Cookie, the old army cook who ran the kitchen, standing over Eddie, the young boy who helped serve tables. A broken plate lay between them, gravy spreading across the floor like spilled blood. "Clumsy fool," Cookie growled, raising his hand. Callum moved, but May was faster. She crossed the room in quick strides, putting herself between Cookie and the boy. "That's enough, Samuel!" Cookie's face was red with drink and anger. "Boy needs to learn. Can't have him dropping plates when we're busy." "The boy needs to eat and sleep, not get knocked around because you've been drinking." May's voice was calm, but carried an edge that could cut glass. "Eddie, go wash up. Take some bread and cheese from the pantry for your supper." Eddie scurried away, throwing a grateful look over his shoulder. Cookie stood swaying, his bulk filling the doorway. "You're too soft on him. And you're too hard. Sleep it off. Samuel, we'll discuss your employment in the morning." For a moment, Callum thought Cookie might argue. The big man's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then he turned and lumbered toward the back door, muttering curses under his breath. May knelt to clean up the broken plate, careful to keep her gloves away from the sharp edges. Callum grabbed a mop to help with the gravy. "You just lost your cook," he observed. "I've lost worse." She deposited the plate shards in a bucket. "Eddie's a good boy. His father died in the mines last winter, and his mother takes in washing but can barely feed them both. I won't have him mistreated under my roof." They cleaned in silence for a few minutes. Then May said, "That room above the stable. How is it?" "Dry. Now that I patched the roof. Why?" "Eddie might be safer there than walking home at night, if you don't mind sharing the space." Callum thought of the boy's thin face, the way he'd flinched when Cookie raised his hand. "I don't mind." May stood, brushing off her skirt. "I'll pay you extra for looking after him." "No need." She studied him again with those sage green eyes. "Most drifters would take any coin offered. Maybe I'm not most drifters." "No," she said quietly. "I'm beginning to see that." Later, after Eddie had been settled in the stable loft with blankets and reassurances, Callum found himself back in the saloon. The place was closed, chairs stacked on tables, but May was still there, sitting at the bar with a ledger open before her. Counting the week's take. She shook her head. Reading the old claims, looking for something the railroad lawyers might have missed. She turned a page, the paper crackling with age. My uncle bought this place in '68. The deed is clear, but they're claiming the water rights were never properly transferred. Callum poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. It was bitter and barely warm, but it gave him something to do with his hands. That why you built here the water? May was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, do you hear it at night when everything's quiet? He nodded, that faint sound of movement beneath the floorboards, like a secret river flowing through the dark. There's a natural spring under this building, she said. My uncle found it when he was digging the foundation. Pure water, untouched, flowing from somewhere deep in the hills. She closed the ledger. The whole town's been fighting over water rights for years. The mines need it for operations. The railroad needs it for their steam engines. But this spring, it's different. It's never been tapped, never been used. Virgin water, the old-timers call it. And that makes it valuable. That makes it everything. She stood, smoothing her gloves. Whoever controls the last untapped water source controls the future of Perdition Creek. The railroad knows it. That's why they want this place so badly. Callum watched her lock the ledger away in the safe. So why not just use it yourself? Sell the water, make your fortune. May's hand stilled on the safe's dial. Because once you open something like that, you can't close it again. And some things, she turned to face him. Some things are worth more untouched. The weight of her words settled between them. Callum thought he understood. But there was something else there, something deeper than just water rights and property claims. I should go, he said finally. Early morning tomorrow. Callum. She stopped him at the door. Thank you for helping with Eddie. He's just a kid, doesn't deserve to be knocked around. No, she agreed. Nobody does. Outside, the night air was cool against his skin. As he walked toward the stable, Callum noticed a light burning in the window of the telegraph office across the street. Through the glass, he could see the operator bent over his key, tapping out a message to somewhere far away. The railroad had eyes everywhere. He realized every notice they posted, every claim they challenged, was part of a larger game. And May Delaney, with her gloves and her guarded spring, stood right in the middle of it. In the stable loft, Eddie was already asleep, curled up like a cat on the spare cot. The boy's face was peaceful in sleep, the wariness gone for now. Callum checked the window, making sure it was latched, then settled onto his own bed. That sound was stronger here, that whisper of water moving through the earth. It reminded him of something, a memory from years ago, before the trail drive that went wrong, before his brother's death. They'd camped by a hidden spring once, he and Tom, and fallen asleep to that same sound. In the morning, Tom had said it sounded like the earth breathing. Now, lying in the dark above May Delaney's stable, Callum wondered if some secrets were like that water powerful precisely because they remained hidden. And he wondered, too, what other secrets May was keeping behind those careful gloves and cautious distances. Somewhere in the night, a door creaked. Footsteps moved across the floor below May, checking the locks one more time. The sound was oddly comforting, like a sentry walking the walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Cookie would need replacing. The railroad would make another move. And Callum would continue the work of fixing what was broken. One board, one nail, one small kindness at a time. But tonight, there was just the sound of hidden water and the breathing of a boy who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply. Sometimes, Callum thought as drowsiness took him, that was enough. Sometimes, that was everything. The days settled into rhythm like dust settling after a windstorm. Callum woke before dawn, his hands remembering the work before his mind fully surfaced from sleep. The tin roof needed patching where rust had eaten through. The back steps, soft with rot, required new planks. The cellar door hung crooked on its hinges, letting in drafts that made the bottles on the shelves sing in the wind. He worked with the methodical patience of a man who'd learned that rushing only meant doing the job twice. Eddie helped when he wasn't serving tables or running errands. Eager to learn. Quick with his hands once shown the proper way. The boy had a gift for seeing what needed doing before being asked bringing water when Callum's throat was dry from sawdust. Holding board steady without being told. May watched it all from her place behind the bar. Those gloved hands always busy with some task. She made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, served it in cups that didn't match but were clean as Sunday. The miners appreciated that, filing in before their shifts with faces still creased from sleep, grateful for the warmth and the silence. May never forced conversation on a man who didn't want it. "You ever think about taking those off?" Eddie asked one morning, pointing at her gloves as she poured his milk. The question hung in the air like smoke. Callum, replacing a floorboard near the piano, kept his head down but listened. "I have sensitive skin," May said evenly. "The lie from cleaning irritates it." Eddie accepted this with a child's easy belief. But Callum heard the practiced nature of the response. How many times had she given that same answer? The piano drew his attention as he worked. It sat there like a faithful dog waiting for its master to return. The bench was worn smooth in the center, and the floor beneath the pedals showed grooves from years of use. But dust had gathered on the keys, and when Callum accidentally bumped against it, the sound was discordant, out of tune. "It needs work," May said, appearing beside him with a cup of coffee. She set it on a coaster, careful as always not to let their hands touch. "Haven't had anyone to play it since Professor Hartwell died last spring." "You don't play?" "No." She studied the piano with an expression he couldn't read. "My hands aren't suited for it." Before he could ask what she meant, the door banged open. 3 men entered, not the usual miners or ranch hands, but strangers in city clothes that looked out of place against the morning light. One carried a leather portfolio. Another had ink stains on his fingers. The third, older than the others, wore a badge that caught the light. Mrs. Delaney." The one with the portfolio stepped forward. "I'm James Whitfield, attorney for the Railroad Land Company. This is Mr. Crane, our surveyor, and Deputy Marshal Morrison." May's expression didn't change, but Callum saw her shoulders tighten. "It's Miss Delaney, and we're not open yet." "We're not here for refreshment." Whitfield opened his portfolio, producing papers covered in dense text. "We're here to serve notice of intent to survey. The railroad has reason to believe there are undocumented water sources on this property. My property rights are clearly established. Your surface rights, yes, but water rights in this territory are complex." Whitfield's smile was thin as paper. "We'll need access to your cellar and any substructures." "No." The word dropped between them like a stone in still water. Deputy Morrison shifted, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his pistol. Not a threat, exactly, but a reminder. "Miss Delaney," Whitfield continued, "I'd advise cooperation. The railroad has been patient, but the railroad has been a vulture, picking at this town's bones." May's voice remained level, but Callum heard steel beneath it. "You've bought out half the claims along the creek, promised water to the mines that you can't deliver, and now you want what's under my floor. The answer is no." "The law says you need a court order for forced entry. Do you have one?" Whitfield's smile faltered. "Not at present, but then, gentlemen, I'll ask you to leave. We open at 7 if you'd like to return as paying customers." The surveyor, Crane, had been scanning the room with sharp eyes. His gaze lingered on the floor near the piano, and Callum saw him make a note in his book. "Interesting construction," he murmured. "The floor here sounds different. Hollow." May moved then, placing herself between Crane and the piano. "Many buildings have root cellars. Nothing interesting about it." "Perhaps not," Whitfield said, closing his portfolio. "But we'll be back. Miss Delaney, with the proper papers. The railroad always gets what it needs." After they left, the silence in the saloon felt heavy as wet wool. Eddie had retreated to the kitchen, and Callum could hear him nervously rattling pots. May stood very still, staring at the door they'd exited through. "They know," she said quietly. Callum moved closer, careful to maintain the distance she always kept. "About the spring. About something, that surveyor he heard it, the hollow sound." She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked genuinely afraid. "If they get a court order, if they gain access, then we make sure they don't find anything." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't hide water, Callum. It finds its own level. Always." He thought about that as he returned to his work. Water did find its level. That was true. But he'd also seen men dam rivers, redirect streams, make the desert bloom, or dry up lakes for gold dust in the sand. Everything could be changed with enough force. The day wore on. Customers came and went, the usual mix of miners, merchants, traveling men with dusty clothes and hollow eyes. May served them all with the same careful courtesy, but Callum noticed how her gaze kept drifting to the floor near the piano, as if she could see through the wood to whatever lay beneath. Late in the afternoon, when the saloon was quiet, he found himself standing over that spot. The boards here were different, older, more carefully fitted. When he knelt and ran his hand along the seams, he felt the slight give that suggested a hatch or trapdoor. "My uncle built it," May said behind him. He hadn't heard her approach. "The entrance to the spring. He sealed it 20 years ago." "Why?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, he found more than water down there. Found something that changed him. He spent a month covering it over, making sure it couldn't be opened easily. Then he made me promise to keep it that way. "And you have?" "Every day for 5 years." She knelt beside him, careful to keep space between them. Her gloved finger traced the outline of the hidden door. "But promises get heavy, Callum, especially when you're carrying them alone." The late light through the windows caught the dust motes in the air, made them dance like tiny stars. Somewhere below, that secret water moved in its courses, patient as time itself. "You're not alone now," Callum said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Fear was still there, but underneath it, something else. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of sharing a burden. "No," she said softly. "I suppose I'm not." That night, after the saloon closed and Eddie was asleep in the loft, Callum found himself back at that spot by the piano. He'd brought a lantern and his tools, thinking to examine the construction more carefully. But as he knelt there, he heard footsteps on the stairs. May appeared in a wrapper over her nightgown, her hair down for the first time since he'd met her. It made her look younger, more vulnerable. She still wore her gloves. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Wanted to understand what we're protecting." She sat on the piano bench, keeping that careful distance even now. "Sometimes I dream about it. The water, I dream it rises up through the floor, fills the whole saloon, drowns the town. Foolish, I know. Dreams aren't foolish. They're just another way of telling the truth." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "You're an unusual man, Callum Hayes. Most drifters don't think so deeply. Most saloon owners don't keep springs under their floors. Touch a sea." She ran her gloved hands over the piano keys without pressing them. "Will you stay when the railroad comes back with their papers?" He thought of all the towns he'd passed through, all the places he'd never let himself remain. But there was something about this woman and her secrets, this boy who needed protecting, this water that sang beneath the floors. "I'll stay," he said. And in that moment, with the lantern light catching in her hair and that hidden water murmuring below, Callum felt something shift inside him, like a door long closed beginning to open, like water finding its level at last. The writ arrived on a Thursday morning. carried by a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Joe Prescott had been deputy sheriff in Perdition Creek for 6 years, long enough to know which fights were worth having and which weren't. The paper in his hand felt heavier than iron. "May," he said, removing his hat as he entered the Quiet Star. "I'm sorry about this." She took the document with steady hands, though Callum noticed the slight tremor in her shoulders. The legal language was dense as mud, but the meaning was clear enough. The Railroad Land Company had obtained a court order to survey all properties along Perdition Creek for undocumented water resources vital to territorial development. "When?" she asked. "Monday. Judge Harmon signed it yesterday in the county seat." Joe shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "They're bringing in a special representative, man named Baird. He's got a reputation for getting what the railroad wants." May folded the writ carefully, as if it were made of glass. "And if I refuse, then I'll have to enforce it, and I'd rather not do that. May, you've been good to this town." After Joe left, May stood behind the bar, staring at nothing. The morning crowd hadn't arrived yet, and the saloon felt hollow as a church on Monday. Eddie was sweeping near the door, trying to look busy while clearly listening. "Should I get more lumber from the mill?" the boy asked. "To board up the cellar." "Boards won't stop legal papers," May said quietly. Callum set down the hammer he'd been using to fix a loose table leg. "There might be another way." May looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes before she tamped it down. "The law is the law. The law says they can survey for undocumented water resources." He moved closer, noting how she didn't step back this time. What if the resources were documented, properly claimed and registered? "My uncle's claim only covers the land and buildings. Water rights weren't separated out back then. Nobody thought they needed to be. But they can be established now, through use and improvement." Callum had spent enough time around mining camps to know how claims worked. You'd need to show active development of the water source, proof that it's being used for the property's benefit. Which means opening the seal, exposing what's down there. May's gloved hands clenched. "You don't understand. My uncle didn't close that chamber because of the water. He closed it because—" She stopped, catching herself. Eddie had drifted closer, broom forgotten in his hands. "Eddie, go check if Cookie needs help with the stove," May said. "But Cookie ain't here yet." "Then set it up for him." After the boy reluctantly left, May walked to the piano. She ran her gloved fingers along its dusty surface, and Callum saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. "My uncle found bones down there," she said finally. "Old bones, from before the town was built. Indian, maybe, or Spanish explorers. He said the chamber felt wrong. Said the water tasted of copper and remembering." She turned to face him. He was a practical man, not given to fancy, but whatever he saw down there scared him enough to seal it and make me promise never to open it. "Bones can't hurt anyone." "Can't they?" She laughed, but it was brittle as dried leaves. "In a town already suspicious of a woman running a saloon, if word got out that I'm sitting on some kind of burial ground, how long before someone decides I'm cursed or worse?" Callum understood then. It wasn't just the water she was protecting, but her place in the community. The careful balance she'd built could shatter with one wrong revelation. "What if we didn't have to open it?" he said slowly, an idea forming. What if there was another way to establish water rights? Before May could respond, the door burst open. The man who entered was everything Joe Prescott wasn't: sharp-dressed, confident, wearing authority like a well-cut coat. Behind him came 2 others, the surveyor Crane and a younger man carrying a heavy ledger. "Miss Delaney." The man's voice was smooth as oil. "I'm Cyrus Baird, special representative of the Railroad Land Company. I believe you've received our writ." "Mr. Baird." May's tone could have frosted windows. "You're early. The writ specifies Monday." "I prefer to scout the terrain before official proceedings." His smile was all teeth. "Helps avoid complications." I trust you won't mind if we look around purely informal. Of course. I mind very much. Return on Monday as the law requires. Baird's smile widened. Come now. Miss Delaney, we're all civilized people here. Surely you understand the railroad's position. This town needs water. The mines need water. Progress needs water. And you're sitting on the last untapped source for 50 miles. What I'm sitting on is my property, legally owned and operated. For now. Baird pulled out a sheaf of papers. Do you know what these are tax records? Seems the Quiet Star has been assessed for property tax, but not for water usage. That's quite an oversight. Years of back taxes on commercial water rights could be substantial. May's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. We don't use the water commercially. We have no pump system. No documented system. Baird walked around the room, his boots loud on the floorboards. He stopped near the piano, and Callum saw him tap his foot experimentally. The hollow sound echoed. But documentation can be flexible, especially when the territorial governor is interested in railroad expansion. Are you threatening me, Mr. Baird? Offering you an opportunity. Sell to the railroad now, and we'll ensure the tax matter disappears. You could relocate, start fresh somewhere without so much history attached. The younger man with the ledger had been writing steadily. Now he looked up. Should I note the structural anomaly near the piano? Sir. By all means. Baird's eyes never left May's face. Document everything. We'll want a complete record when we return on Monday. After they left, the saloon felt smaller somehow, as if their presence had stolen some of the air. May sank onto a chair, and for the first time since Callum had known her, she looked defeated. Back taxes, she said hollowly. They'll manufacture whatever number they want, even if I fight it, the legal fees alone. You're not alone in this, Callum said. She looked up at him, and he saw tears threatening behind her careful composure. Why do you care? You could ride out tomorrow, find work anywhere. Why stay for this fight? He thought about how to answer that. Thought about 3 years of drifting, of never staying long enough to matter to anyone. Thought about his brother's death and the guilt that had driven him to the edges of every town, every connection. Maybe I'm tired of running, he said finally. Maybe I found something worth standing still for. May stood abruptly, turning away, but not before he saw something shift in her expression. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. There is one possibility. The territorial law has a provision. Water rights can be claimed jointly by married couples. With both names on the deed, it makes it harder to challenge, harder to seize through tax claims. The words hung between them like morning mist. Callum felt his heart beat once, twice, before he trusted himself to speak. Is that a proposal, Miss Delaney? She turned back to him, and despite everything, the threat, the fear, the weight of secrets, he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It's a business arrangement, Mr. Hayes. Nothing more. Of course, he agreed, though something in his chest said otherwise. It would be a marriage in name only, for the protection of the property. You understand? I understand. She pulled off one glove then, just for a moment, and he saw her hand clearly for the first time. The skin was unmarked, pale as pearl, but she held it like something fragile or dangerous. Think about it, she said, pulling the glove back on quickly. It's not a decision to make lightly. Marriage, even one of convenience, has weight to it. That night, Callum lay in his narrow bed above the stable, listening to Eddie's quiet breathing and the eternal whisper of water below. He thought about May's bare hand, how ordinary and extraordinary it had looked. Thought about the fear in her eyes when Baird had tapped the floor. Thought about promises made and secrets kept, and the weight of standing witness to someone else's burden. By morning, his decision was made. Some fights you walked away from. Others, you faced with whatever weapons came to hand. even if that weapon was a wedding ring and a lie told in the service of a greater truth. The water sang its ancient song beneath the floors, and Callum Hayes, drifter no more, prepared to make his stand. The fire started small, just a flicker of orange against the darkness behind the quiet star. Callum smelled at first that sharp bite of burning wood that cut through the usual scents of spilled beer and sawdust. He'd been checking the locks, making his final rounds before heading to the stable, when the smoke began to curl under the back door. "Fire!" His shout cracked through the quiet saloon. May was still at the bar, counting the night's receipts. Her head snapped up, and in one smooth motion, she swept the money into the cash box and moved toward him. "Where?" "Out back, near the storeroom." They burst through the door together. The flames had caught the pile of old crates stacked against the building, climbing toward the roof with hungry fingers. The paint on the walls was already beginning to blister. "Water buckets in the kitchen," May called, but Callum was already moving. They worked without words, forming a two-person brigade. Fill, pass, throw, fill, pass, throw. The smoke thickened, turning the air gray and acrid. "It's spreading too fast," May coughed. The flames had found the tar paper on the roof, racing along the edge. "We need more help." "I'll wake the neighbors." "No time." She grabbed his arm, and even through the chaos, he noticed it was the first time she'd voluntarily touched him. The whole building could go. That's when Callum saw them, three figures silhouetted against the far building, watching. One raised something to his lips, a bottle. They were drinking while the quiet star burned. Rage flared in his chest, hot as the flames, but May was already moving, pulling him back toward the door. "Inside, now!" "But the fire—" "Inside?" They stumbled through the smoke into the kitchen. May went straight to a corner cabinet, yanking it open to reveal not dishes but tools, axes, hammers, a crowbar. She grabbed the crowbar and thrust it at him. "The floor by the piano. Open it." "May." "Open it?" Her gloves were singed. One finger burned through. He could see pale skin beneath. "It's the only way." He ran to the main room, dropping to his knees by the piano. The seams Eddie had shown him were nearly invisible, but the crowbar found purchase. Old nails screamed as he pried. Behind him, he could hear May dragging something heavy across the kitchen floor. The first board came up, revealing darkness below. Then another. The smell that rose from the opening was strange, mineral-rich and cold, cutting through the smoke, and underneath, something else. Copper, age, memory. "Stand back." May appeared with a hand pump and a coil of leather hose. Her face was streaked with soot. Her careful composure cracked. "Help me lower this." Together, they fed the hose into the dark opening. Callum could hear water down there, moving with more force than he'd expected. Not a still pool, but a living flow. May began to pump. For a moment, nothing. Then water burst from the hose's end, clear and cold and smelling of deep places. She directed the stream through the back door, and Callum heard the hiss of flame meeting water. "Take over!" she gasped, her arms shaking from the effort. He grabbed the pump handle, putting his back into it. The water came easier now, as if the spring below had awakened and was eager to rise. They fought the fire with water that had never seen sunlight, water that carried the taste of centuries in its flow, and slowly, impossibly, they won. The flames retreated, sputtered, died. What remained was a blackened wall, damaged but standing. May sank to the floor beside the opened seal, her chest heaving. One glove had burned away entirely, and she cradled that hand against her chest. In the lamplight, Callum could see it clearly unmarked, unburned despite the fire. "Perfect." "Your hand," he said. She looked down as if surprised. Then, with visible effort, she extended it toward him. "Help me up." He took her hand without hesitation. Her skin was soft, warm, alive. Nothing happened. No curse fell. The world didn't end. Just two people, touching in the aftermath of disaster. She must have seen something in his face because she almost smiled. Disappointed, were you expecting claw scales? I was expecting you to pull away. So was I. She looked at their joined hands with wonder. It's been 5 years. 5 years since I let anyone... The front door burst open. Joe Prescott rushed in, followed by half a dozen townspeople carrying buckets. They stopped short at the scene, the opened floor. The pump. May and Callum hand in hand. We saw the smoke, Joe said slowly. Came to help, but... His eyes fixed on the hole by the piano. May, what have you done? She stood, not releasing Callum's hand. What I should have done years ago. The crowd pressed closer. Peering into the opening, someone held a lantern over the gap, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. The sound of water was stronger now, echoing up from below. Is that, someone whispered, is that the Virgin Spring? Not anymore, May said quietly. Now it's just water. Water that saved this building. Water that can save this town if we use it wisely. But the railroad, Joe started. The railroad wanted to steal it. I've chosen to share it. She squeezed Callum's hand. With my husband. The silence that followed was complete. Then Joe Prescott did something unexpected. He laughed. Well, I'll be damned. When did this happen? It hasn't yet. May turned to Callum. That is, if the offer still stands. He thought about the woman beside him, her secrets laid bare, her hand warm in his. Thought about the spring below, finally free after years of darkness. Thought about the difference between running from something and running toward it. It stands, he said. The crowd erupted in questions, exclamations, but May raised her free hand for silence. Father Miguel is due through town on Sunday. We'll make it official then, and on Monday, when Mr. Baird returns with his writs and threats, he'll find the water rights properly claimed and documented, in both our names. That's 3 days away, someone pointed out. What's to stop the railroad from moving sooner? May smiled then, and it was sharp as broken glass. Because I've already sent word to the territorial recorder. The moment we opened this spring and began using it, we established our claim. The marriage just makes it ironclad. As the crowd dispersed, arguing and explaining among themselves, Callum found himself alone with May in the damaged saloon. The hole in the floor gaped between them and the past. We should cover this, he said. Make it safe. Tomorrow. Tonight. She looked at her bare hand, flexed the fingers. Tonight I want to remember what it feels like. To touch and be touched without fear. What were you afraid of? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, my mother died when I was born. My father said I had her hands, said they were too fine for this world, that I needed to protect them, keep them covered, keep them safe. She laughed, but it was edged with old pain. He died when I was 15. Left me with nothing but warnings and this idea that my hands were somehow precious, dangerous, that if I let anyone close, something terrible would happen. And now I think maybe the terrible thing was the distance itself. She turned to him. I've served drinks with gloves on for 5 years, kept everyone at arm's length, built a life on being untouchable, and for what to guard a secret that was never really a secret at all. Callum thought he understood. The spring, the hands, the careful distance, all of it wrapped around the same fear, the fear of being truly known, of being touched and found wanting. For what it's worth, he said, I think your hands are just fine as they are. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. So are yours, Callum Hayes, scarred and calloused and honest. So are yours. They stood there in the smoke-damaged saloon, the secret spring breathing beneath their feet, and Callum felt something shift in the air between them. Not love, not yet, but possibility, understanding, the first green shoot of trust pushing through old ground. Outside, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Soon, the town would wake. There would be questions to answer, repairs to make, a marriage to plan that was both false and true. But for now, there was just this two people who had spent too long running from touch, standing close enough to feel each other's warmth. "I should check the damage," May said finally. But she didn't move. "I should make sure Eddie's all right," Callum agreed, equally still. Another moment passed. Then May stepped back, but her movement was reluctant. "Thank you for the fire, for everything. Thank you for trusting me. With the spring, with your hand, with the truth," she finished. Yes, that most of all. As Callum walked toward the stable, he could hear the spring gurgling beneath the saloon, finally free to flow, like May's carefully guarded hands, like his own guarded heart. Some secrets, he thought, weren't meant to be kept forever. Some were just waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right touch to set them free. The evening after the fire, they sat in the damaged kitchen while Eddie swept ash from the corners. The boy had taken the morning's revelations in stride, more concerned with the practical matter of fixing the burned wall than with the implications of May's exposed secret. Youth had that gift accepting the extraordinary as simply another part of life's pattern. May had replaced her burned gloves with an old pair, but she pulled them off now, setting them aside with deliberate care. Her hands folded around a cup of coffee, and Callum found himself studying them not because they were remarkable, but because they were so utterly ordinary. Working hands, with a small scar near the left thumb and calluses from years of honest labor. "I should tell you about Tom," Callum said suddenly. May looked up, waiting. She had that quality of stillness, of giving a person room to speak without rushing to fill the silence. "My younger brother, 5 years younger, but you'd never know it from how he acted. Always pushing ahead, always sure the next town, the next job, the next card game would be the one that changed everything." Callum turned his own cup, watching the coffee swirl. "I was supposed to watch out for him. That's what older brothers do." "What happened?" "Cattle drive 3 years ago. Nothing special about it, 500 head from Texas up to Kansas. Good money if you made it. And we needed the money. Tom had debts, the kind that follow you from town to town." He paused, remembering. "Third week out, we hit weather, not a storm. Exactly, but that heavy waiting air that means trouble's coming. The herd was restless. Eddie had stopped sweeping, drawn by the story. May gestured for him to sit, and he perched on a crate, broom still in hand. The trail boss wanted to push through, make the river crossing before the storm hit. I knew it was wrong, could feel it in my bones, but Tom was all for it, said I worried too much, that I was always holding him back." Callum's voice had gone flat, the way voices do when they're carrying too much weight. "So I gave in, told myself maybe he was right. Maybe I was too cautious. The storm hit when we were halfway across. Cattle panicked. Water rose fast, flash flood from upstream. Tom was riding flank, trying to keep them together." He stopped, swallowed. His horse went down. He could have made it if he'd let go of the reins, but he held on, always held on too tight to everything. May reached across the table, her bare hand covering his. The touch was warm, anchoring. "I got to him, but too late. Pulled him out, but—" Callum shook his head. "The trail boss said it wasn't my fault. The other hand said the same, even wrote it up that way in the report. But I knew better. If I'd stood firm, if I'd insisted we wait, Tom would still be telling terrible jokes and losing at cards." "You couldn't have known," May said softly. "Maybe not, but I could have trusted what I felt instead of what he wanted." He turned his hand palm up, fingers interlacing with hers. "I've been drifting since then. 3 years of fixing other people's fences, mending other people's roofs, Never staying long enough to matter, because mattering means maybe failing someone again. Eddie shifted on his crate. But you stayed here. You're helping Miss May. Yes, Callum agreed, looking at May. I stayed. May squeezed his hand once before letting go. My turn, then. She stood, moving to the window where the last light was fading. My father ran a seminary school back east. Very proper. Very concerned with appearances. My mother came from old Virginia family, the kind that had portraits in gold frames and silver that needed polishing. She touched the window pane, leaving a brief print on the glass. When she died, birthing me, Father couldn't bear to look at my hands. Said they were exactly like hers. Too fine for this world. He'd say, too easily damaged. So he taught me to hide them. Gloves for church, gloves for school, gloves for every occasion. Must have been hard. Eddie ventured, especially in summer. May smiled at him. It was, but children adapt. I learned to write with gloves on, to eat carefully, to never touch anyone directly. Father said it was for my protection, but I think now it was for his. Seeing my mother's hands on his daughter, it hurt him. She turned back to them. When I was 15, Father took sick, lung fever. I nursed him for weeks, and near the end, he was delirious, kept calling me Margaret, my mother's name. One night, he grabbed my hand, pulled the glove off before I could stop him. Her voice dropped. He looked at it for the longest time. Then he said, I'm sorry. Margaret, I've taught her to be a ghost. The kitchen was quiet, except for the tick of the cooling stove. He died 2 days later. Left me a little money and a lot of confusion. I went west because it seemed like a place where people could start over. Ended up here when my uncle offered me work. When he died and left me the saloon, I thought about leaving. But by then, I'd learned something. What? Eddie asked, caught up in the story. That hiding isn't the same as being safe. It's just another kind of prison. She came back to the table, sat down with that careful grace. When those men started leaving those signs, calling me names, trying to drive me out, I realized I'd traded one set of walls for another. The gloves, the distance, the secret under the floor, all of it was just fear dressed up as protection. Callum understood then why she'd agreed to the marriage plan. Not just for the legal protection, but for the chance to stop running from connection. Neither of you got to choose different, Eddie said suddenly. They both looked at him. The boy flushed but continued. I mean, things happened to you when you were young, shaped you wrong, but now you're choosing different. Out of the mouths of babes. Callum thought. That's right, Eddie. We're choosing different. May stood again, businesslike now. Speaking of choices, we need to discuss practical matters. Sunday is 2 days away. If we're doing this, we're doing it, Callum said firmly. Then we need witnesses. Joe Prescott, certainly, and perhaps Mrs. Chen from the boarding house. She's been kind to me. May pulled out a piece of paper, began making a list. We'll need to file the documentation immediately and establish clear records of the water usage. I can help with that. Eddie offered, I'm good with numbers. Could keep a ledger of how much water we draw, what it's used for. That's good thinking, Callum said. The boy beamed. They worked through the details, who to notify, what to file, how to present their claim when Baird returned. It was strange, Callum thought. Planning a wedding like a military campaign. But perhaps that's what it was, a defensive action against forces that would steal what May had protected for so long. Later, when Eddie had gone to bed and they were alone in the damaged kitchen, May asked, Are you sure about this marriage is significant, even one for legal purposes? I've been married before, Callum said, surprising himself with the admission. Common law, down in Arizona. She was a rancher's daughter, sweet as spring water. Lasted 6 months before she figured out I was broken inside. Left me for a merchant who could give her a real home, not just a saddle and promises. You're not broken, May said firmly. Bent, maybe, Scarred, certainly, but not broken. "Neither are you." They stood facing each other in the lamplight. Two people who'd spent years perfecting the art of distance. Tomorrow would bring preparations, legalities, the business of turning a necessity into something that could pass for truth. But tonight, they had the honest sharing of old wounds, the first tentative trust between two cautious hearts. "I should go," Callum said finally. "Early morning tomorrow." "Yes." May walked him to the door. "Callum, thank you for listening, for staying, for seeing me. Not the mystery or the secret or the woman who owns a saloon, but just me. Thank you for letting yourself be seen." As he crossed to the stable, Callum thought about Tom, about choices made and unmade, about the weight of carrying someone else's life in your hands. He thought about May's father, teaching his daughter to be a ghost out of his own grief. How much of what we call protection is really just fear wearing a kindly mask? But mostly, he thought about Sunday, about standing before Father Miguel and speaking words that would be both true and false, a performance that was also a promise. He'd failed to save his brother by being too slow to act. He wouldn't fail May by hesitating now. The water sang beneath the saloon floor, finally free to flow where it would. And Callum Hayes, who'd spent 3 years running from the sound of rushing water, found himself walking toward it at last. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that made the desert air shimmer like water. Father Miguel had arrived the night before, his wagon dusty from the circuit that took him to 3 towns every month. He was a small man with hands that moved like birds when he talked, and eyes that seemed to see through the surface of things to what lay beneath. May stood before the cracked mirror in her room above the saloon, wearing her best dress dove gray with small pearl buttons, saved for occasions that rarely came. Her hands were bare, and she flexed them nervously, still unused to the sensation of air on her skin. "You look fine," said Mrs. Chen from the doorway. The boarding house owner had arrived early with a small bouquet of desert roses from her garden. "Stop fussing." "I'm not fussing," May said, then immediately adjusted her collar. "It's just, I never thought I'd do this. Marriage. Any of it, the dress, the ceremony, she gestured helplessly. "The touching." Mrs. Chen moved into the room, her own hands gentle as she fixed a loose pin in May's hair. "My grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear. You've been brave for years. May Delaney, this is just a different kind of brave." Downstairs, Callum waited in the saloon's main room. He'd bought a new shirt for the occasion, and Eddie had insisted on trimming his hair. Joe Prescott stood beside him, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, but determined to see this through. "You sure about this?" Joe asked quietly. "Marriage is a big step, even when it's for practical reasons." Callum thought about May's hands wrapped around a coffee cup, about the way she'd covered his hand when he told her about Tom. "I'm sure." Father Miguel had set up near the piano, transforming the scarred bar into something resembling an altar with a white cloth and 2 candles. The hole in the floor had been covered with new boards, but everyone could still hear the water moving beneath. When May appeared at the top of the stairs, Callum felt his breath catch. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked so determined, like a woman walking into battle with her chin up and her fears tucked away where they couldn't slow her down. She descended slowly, Mrs. Chen beside her. Eddie waited at the bottom with a grin that threatened to split his face. The boy had polished his shoes and slicked back his hair, taking his role as witness seriously. "Ready?" May asked when she reached Callum. "Ready," he confirmed, and offered her his arm. They stood before Father Miguel, the morning light slanting through the windows and catching the dust motes in the air. The priest's voice was soft but carried clearly as he began the simple ceremony. "We are gathered here to witness the union of May Delaney and Callum Hayes. Marriage is many things: a legal contract, a sacred bond, a partnership against the troubles of the world. But at its heart, it is a promise A promise to stand together when standing alone would be easier. Callum felt May's hand tremble slightly where it rested on his arm. Without thinking, he covered it with his own, steadying her. Callum Hayes. Father Miguel continued. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife to protect and defend, to support and sustain, in whatever trials may come?
I do.
The words came out stronger than he'd expected, filling the space. May Delaney, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to trust and be trusted, to stand beside in whatever storms may blow? May's voice was quiet but clear.
I do.
The rings. Eddie stepped forward proudly, producing 2 simple gold bands from his pocket. They'd bought them yesterday from the general store, plain and practical, but genuine. Callum took May's hand, marveling again at how normal it felt. Just a hand, just skin and bone and the warmth of life. He slipped the ring onto her finger, the metal catching the light. With this ring, he said, following Father Miguel's prompting, I pledge my truth. May took his hand in turn, and he saw her swallow hard before speaking. With this ring, I pledge my trust. Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife. Father Miguel smiled. You may kiss your bride. This was the part they hadn't discussed, the necessary seal to make it official, but also the first real test of their agreement. Callum leaned down slowly, giving May time to pull away if she chose. She didn't. Their lips met briefly, a touch as light as a promise, as careful as hope. When they parted, May's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she was smiling. Now then, Joe Prescott said, clearing his throat roughly. Let's get this paperwork handled before Baird shows up tomorrow. They signed the marriage certificate there at the bar, Joe and Mrs. Chen adding their names as witnesses. Eddie insisted on signing too, his careful letters showing the pride he took in being part of this moment. And now, May said, her voice steady again.
The water rights.
She produced the key from her pocket iron, old, worn smooth by her uncle's hands and then her own. Together, she and Callum lifted the new boards covering the entrance to the spring. The smell that rose was cleaner now, less copper in age, more mineral and life. Eddie, Callum said, bring the bucket and rope. They drew the first official water from the spring as married couple, the bucket coming up full of liquid so clear it seemed to hold light. May poured it into a clean jar, labeled it with the date and their names. First draw from the Hayes Delaney claim, she announced. Let the record show that this water source is now actively used for the benefit of the property and its owners. Mrs. Chen produced a camera, a surprise that made May gasp. For the documentation, she said simply, stand together by the well. They posed stiffly at first, unused to being photographed. Then Eddie said something that made May laugh, and Callum felt himself relax. When the flash powder went off, it captured something true, 2 people choosing to stand together, water rights and wedding rings and all. After the witnesses left, promising to file the papers immediately, May and Callum found themselves alone in the saloon. The ceremony was over, but the reality of what they'd done seemed to fill the space between them.
So, May said finally, we're married.
We are.
It feels...
She paused, searching for words.
Both more and less than I expected. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. He moved to the bar, pouring them both coffee from the pot that was always kept warm. What now? Now we wait for Baird. Show him the papers. Establish our claim. She accepted the cup, wrapping both hands around it. And then we make it work. The saloon, the water, He gestured between them. This. May set down her cup and moved to the piano. She lifted the lid, running her bare fingers over the keys without pressing them. My uncle used to play, said music made any place feel more like home. You could learn.
She laughed softly. With these hands, they've been hidden so long. I'm not sure they remember how to do anything but pour drinks and count money.
Callum joined her at the piano, sitting on the bench. Only one way to find out. He played a simple chord, the notes ringing clear despite the instrument's age. Put your hand here. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his. Together, they pressed the keys, creating a harmony that filled the empty saloon. It wasn't music, exactly, but it was a beginning. My brother loved to sing, Callum said quietly. Terrible voice, but he never let that stop him. Used to say that the point of music wasn't to be perfect, but to be heard. What was his favorite song? Red River Valley. Sang it every night on the trail, until the other hands threatened to gag him. He smiled at the memory. I haven't heard it since he died. May's hand tightened over his. Play it. He found the notes slowly, muscle memory returning. The melody was simple, sweet, achingly familiar, and as he played, he felt something ease in his chest, a knot that had been tied for 3 years, finally beginning to loosen. When the last note faded, May spoke. He'd be proud of you, for staying, for choosing to build something instead of drift. Maybe. Callum turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. I'd like to think so. They sat there as the afternoon light shifted through the windows. 2 people bound by law and necessity, and something that might, given time and trust, grow into more. Below their feet, the spring gurgled and sang, finally free to flow, and in the quiet saloon, with their rings still new and their promises still fresh, May and Callum Hayes began the delicate work of turning a marriage of convenience into a marriage of truth. Tomorrow would bring Baird and his threats, the railroad and its hunger. But today, there was coffee and sunlight and the slow, careful touching of hands that were learning they had nothing to fear. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn quiet like a fist through glass. Callum was thrown from his cot, hitting the stable floor hard as dust and hay rained down. His first thought was earthquake, but then he smelled the acrid bite of blasting powder. Eddie. He crawled through the debris to where the boy's cot had been. Eddie was curled beneath his overturned bed, eyes wide but unharmed. I'm okay, the boy gasped. What was? Another explosion, closer this time. The stable wall buckled, and Callum grabbed Eddie, hauling him toward the door. Outside, he could see flames licking at the back of the quiet star. But this wasn't like the controlled fire from before. This was violence given form. The saloon! Eddie tried to run toward it, but Callum held him back. Wait. He scanned the chaos. Dark figures moved between buildings, at least a dozen of them. Some carried torches, others had rifles. This wasn't random destruction, it was an assault. May appeared in the saloon's doorway, still in her nightgown, but with her father's old shotgun in her hands. Callum? He pushed Eddie behind a water trough. Stay down. Don't move until I come for you. Then he was running, zigzagging across the open ground as a rifle cracked somewhere to his left. He reached May just as another explosion rocked the building's foundation. They're trying to collapse it, May said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Drive us out so they can claim abandonment. Baird. Who else? She fired the shotgun over the heads of 2 men approaching with torches, sending them scrambling for cover. He must have decided not to wait for legal channels. Glass shattered above them as someone threw a rock through the upper window. Inside the saloon, Callum could hear voices. Some of the morning shift miners had been having their coffee when the attack started. How many inside? He asked. 6, maybe 7. Plus Sarah and her daughter. They were sleeping in the back room. Sarah was one of the saloon girls, a widow with a 10-year-old daughter named Grace. The thought of them trapped in there with explosions and fire made Callum's blood run cold. We need to get them out. The front's blocked. May pointed to where several armed men had taken position across the street. But there's another way. She led him back inside, through smoke that was thickening by the moment. The miners had overturned tables for cover, and old Pete had his ancient revolver out, though his hands shook too badly to aim. "Where's Sarah?" May called. "Back room," someone answered. "Doors jammed, explosion shifted the frame." Callum grabbed an axe from behind the bar. "May, get everyone ready to move. Pete, watch the front." He found the door solid wood, now wedged tight in its twisted frame. Through it, he could hear Grace crying and Sarah's voice trying to soothe her. "Stand back from the door," he shouted, then swung the axe. The blade bit deep, sending splinters flying. Another swing, another. The wood was old, dry, and tough as iron. Behind him, May was organizing the resistance. "Jenny, take those water buckets to the kitchen if they throw more torches. We'll need them. Marcus, you and Johnny watch the windows. Don't shoot unless you have to. We don't want to give them an excuse to storm the place." Another explosion, this one close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Callum swung harder, feeling the door begin to give. One more strike and it split enough for him to kick it open. Sarah huddled in the corner with Grace, both covered in plaster dust from the cracking walls. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "Can you walk?" Yes, but Grace, she hurt her ankle when the first blast hit. Callum scooped up the girl without hesitation. "Follow me. May's got a plan." Back in the main room, May had pulled back a section of carpet near the bar, revealing a trap door. "Old bootlegger's tunnel," she explained. "Leads to the storm cellar behind Chen's boarding house." "You knew about this?" Callum asked. "My uncle showed me, called it insurance." She helped Sarah down into the darkness. "Jenny, you next, then the others." "What about you?" Pete demanded. "Someone needs to keep them busy while you get clear." May checked the shotgun's load. "Callum and I will hold them." "Like hell." Pete started, but another explosion cut him off. This one brought down part of the back wall, and flames began creeping across the floor. "Go," May ordered. "Now." They went, one by one, into the tunnel. Callum handed Grace down to waiting arms, then turned back to May. "This is suicide. There's too many of them." "Maybe." She moved to the window, fired another shot that sent the attackers diving for cover. "But if we run now, we lose everything. The saloon, the water rights. Our legal claim, Baird wins." A voice called from outside. Baird himself, no longer hiding behind hired guns. "Mrs. Hayes, or is it still Miss Delaney? This doesn't have to continue. Sign over the property rights, and everyone walks away unharmed." "Everyone except us," Callum muttered. May called back. "I have a counteroffer. Mr. Baird, you and your men leave now, and I don't press charges for arson, assault, and attempted murder." Baird laughed. "With what witnesses? Who's going to testify against the railroad?" That's when Callum heard a sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats. Lots of them. He risked a look out the shattered window and saw riders coming hard from the east, dust cloud rising behind them like a wall. "May," he said, "we've got company." She joined him at the window, then smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since the attack began. "It's the Apache Junction mining crew. Pete must have gotten word to them somehow." The riders swept into town like an avenging army. These weren't hired guns or railroad thugs. These were working men who'd had their morning coffee in May's saloon for years, who'd been served fairly regardless of their standing, who'd watched her face down trouble with nothing but words and courage. The firing from outside faltered, then stopped. Callum could see Baird's men looking around nervously as they found themselves outnumbered 3-1. "Drop your weapons," a voice boomed. Big Jim McKinney, foreman of the largest mine, rode at the head of the group. "Any man still armed in 10 seconds gets a month's worth of angry miners to deal with." Guns hit the ground like rain. May stepped out of the saloon, shotgun still in her hands but lowered now. Callum followed, watching her back. The sun was rising, painting the smoke and dust in shades of gold and red. "Mr. Baird," May said conversationally. as if they were meeting over tea. "I believe you were leaving." Baird's face was mottled with rage, but he was trapped and knew it. "This isn't over. The railroad has resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, government connections."
"And I have this."
May reached into her pocket, pulling out a small leather journal.
"Your man Crane dropped it during the fire the other night. Interesting reading. Names, dates, amounts paid to various officials. I'm sure the territorial governor would be fascinated."
Baird went very still.
"You wouldn't dare."
"Try me." May's voice was steel-wrapped in silk.
"I've made copies, of course, sent them to various interested parties, but I'm willing to make a deal. The railroad forgets about Perdition Creek, and I forget about this journal."
For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Baird nodded once, sharp as a blade. "You'll regret this."
"I doubt it."
May watched as he gathered his men and rode out. Their planned conquest turned to humiliating retreat. As the dust settled, the miners began organizing bucket brigades to fight the fires. The Quiet Star was damaged, but not destroyed. The explosions had been meant to frighten more than demolish, and the solid construction had held.
Eddie came running from his hiding spot, throwing his arms around Callum's waist. "I thought I was so scared."
"It's okay," Callum said, ruffling the boy's hair.
"We're all okay."
Sarah and Grace emerged from Chen's boarding house, along with the others who'd escaped through the tunnel.
There were tears,
embraces, the shaky laughter of people who'd faced death and come through together. May stood apart slightly, watching it all. The shotgun hung loose in her hands, and Callum could see the tremor she'd hidden during the fight. He moved to her side, careful not to touch. They were in public. After all, and marriage or not, she had her boundaries. But May surprised him. She let the shotgun fall and turned into his chest, her arms going around him as the fear and fury finally caught up. He held her while she shook, this woman who'd stood against hired guns with nothing but determination.
"You did it," he said quietly. "You saved everyone." "We did it," she corrected, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I couldn't have if you hadn't been here."
"I'm here," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and what he saw in her eyes made his breath catch. Trust. Yes, but something more. Something that had nothing to do with water rights or legal protection. Around them, the town was waking to a new day. The railroad's grab had failed, turned back by community and courage. The Quiet Star stood wounded but unbroken, water still flowing beneath its floors. And May Delaney May Hayes now stood with her husband's arms around her in the middle of the street, her bare hands visible to all, finally understanding that some battles couldn't be won alone, that sometimes the greatest strength was in letting others stand beside you when the explosions came. The sun climbed higher, burning away the smoke and fear, and Perdition Creek began the slow work of healing. But in that moment, in the aftermath of violence turned to victory, there was only this two people holding each other while a town rebuilt itself around them. Proof that sometimes the deepest wells were not of water, but of human connection. Dawn broke cold and clear 3 days after the attack, painting Perdition Creek in shades of amber and rose. The town had spent those days in watchful preparation, boarding windows, stockpiling ammunition, sending the children to stay with relatives in neighboring settlements. Everyone knew Baird would return. Men like him didn't accept defeat easily. May stood at the saloon's repaired window, coffee cooling in her hands. The miners had worked through the night to shore up the damaged walls, and the place almost looked normal. Almost, but she could still smell smoke in the curtains, still see the scorch marks on the floor where fire had tried to claim her life's work. "They're coming," Eddie said from the doorway, his young face serious. He'd been stationed on the roof of Chen's boarding house since before dawn, watching the road. May set down her cup carefully. No tremor in her hands now. She'd moved past fear into something colder, more determined. "How many? 15, maybe 20? Baird's in front. They've got a man in a suit with them, looks official. Judge Harmon, Callum said, entering from the back room where he'd been checking weapons. Baird must have gotten him to issue new papers. May nodded. She'd expected this. Eddie, go ring the bell. 3 times, then pause, then 3 more. Let everyone know. The boy ran off, and soon the church bell was tolling their agreed-upon signal. Within minutes, the street began to fill not with gunmen, but with the ordinary citizens of Perdition Creek, miners off shift, merchants, mothers with flowers still on their aprons. They came quietly, purposefully, forming a loose line in front of the quiet star. "What are they doing?" Callum asked, moving to stand beside her. "What communities do," May replied, standing together. By the time Baird's group reached the saloon, they faced not 2 defenders but 50, men and women who'd decided that some things were worth the risk. Old Pete stood front and center, his ancient revolver prominent on his hip. Mrs. Chen held a rolling pin like she meant to use it. Even the school teacher, Miss Patterson, was there with her pupils' parents, all of them silent and resolute. Baird reined in his horse, his face darkening as he took in the scene. Judge Harmon, a thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, clutched a leather portfolio to his chest. "This is a legal matter." Baird called out, "Interference with court orders is a serious crime. So is attempted murder." Big Jim McKinney replied from his spot near Pete. "Arson too. Got plenty of witnesses to both." "Hearsay and lies," Baird spat. "I've brought Judge Harmon to settle this properly. The water rights to this property were never legally established. The marriage between Miss Delaney and this drifter is obviously a sham, designed to circumvent—" "Careful," May interrupted. Stepping out of the saloon, Callum followed, noting how she'd left her gloves inside. Her bare hands caught the morning light as she moved. Questioning the validity of a marriage performed by a recognized minister, properly witnessed and recorded, could be seen as slander. Judge Harmon cleared his throat nervously. "I'm simply here to review the documentation. Mrs. Hayes, if everything is in order—" "It is," Joe Prescott said, pushing through the crowd. He carried a wooden box, which he set on a barrel in full view. Marriage certificate, water rights claim, records of usage and improvement. Even got a telegram here from the territorial office confirming receipt and approval. The judge dismounted to examine the papers, his thin fingers shuffling through them carefully. Baird watched with growing fury as his legal authority crumbled. "There's also this," May added, producing Crane's journal, which contains some fascinating information about bribes paid to various officials. "I wonder, Judge Harmon, if your name might appear in here." The judge went very pale. That is, the documents appear to be in order. The water rights are clearly established under the joint ownership of Mr. and Mrs. Hayes." "This is ridiculous," Baird snarled. "You can't seriously believe—" That's when they heard it, a low rumble from the east, growing louder. Dust rose on the horizon, and soon they could make out shapes wagons, dozens of them, raising a cloud that turned the morning sky brown. "What the hell?" someone muttered. The wagons rolled into town like an invasion, but the men driving them wore no railroad badges. Instead, they carried the sun-darkened look of farmers, ranchers, homesteaders from the settlements scattered across the territory. At their head rode a woman Callum recognized, Mrs. Elizabeth Crenshaw, who ran the Territorial Water Rights Association. "Mrs. Crenshaw," May called out, genuine surprise in her voice. "What brings you to Perdition Creek?" The older woman dismounted with surprising agility for her 60 years. "Word travels, Mrs. Hayes. When we heard the railroad was trying to steal another water source, we decided it was time to take a stand." She turned to address Baird, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been fighting this battle for decades. "Mr. Baird, I have here petitions from 16 communities. all victims of the railroad's water grabbing. We've also compiled evidence of illegal seizures, forged documents, and intimidation tactics spanning 3 counties. From the wagons, men began unloading crates, documents. Callum realized. Hundreds of files, testimonies, evidence of the railroad's systematic theft of water rights across the territory. Furthermore, Mrs. Crenshaw continued, "We've been in communication with certain newspapers back east. They're very interested in how the railroad has been conducting business out here. Bad for investment. You understand. When word gets out about corporate theft and violence." Baird's horse shifted nervously. Sensing its rider's rage, "You can't threaten the railroad. We have resources. And we have the truth," Mrs. Crenshaw replied calmly. "Plus about 300 very angry homesteaders who've decided they've had enough. Would you like to test which is stronger?" The silence stretched taut as wire. Callum kept his hand near his gun, watching Baird's men for any sign of movement, but they looked uncertain now, seeing the odds shifting against them. Then May did something unexpected. She walked forward, stopping just feet from Baird's horse. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly. "I'll make you one final offer. Mr. Baird, leave now. Don't come back. The railroad forgets about Perdition Creek, and we forget about you. The water here will be shared fairly, the town, the mines, even the railroad if it asks politely and pays fairly. But it won't be stolen. Not by you, not by anyone. And if I refuse," May smiled, and it was sharp as winter wind, "then Mrs. Crenshaw sends her evidence to those eastern newspapers. Judge Harmon here explains to the territorial governor how his name ended up in your payoff ledger. And these good people," she gestured to the crowd, which had grown to nearly 100. "They decide how to handle a man who attacks women and children in the night." Baird's hand twitched toward his gun, and instantly 20 weapons cleared leather. The sound was like metal rain, hammers cocking in unison. "I wouldn't," Callum said quietly, his own Colt steady in his hand. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Baird slowly raised his hands, showing them empty. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," May said simply. "It is." Baird turned his horse, his men following. Judge Harmon scrambled back onto his mount, eager to distance himself from the whole affair. They rode out in silence, the dust of their departure mixing with the larger cloud from the homesteaders' wagons. As soon as they were gone, a cheer went up from the crowd. People surged forward, shaking hands, embracing, laughing with the relief of danger past. May found herself at the center of it all, accepting congratulations with a dazed smile. "You did it, girl, Mrs. Crenshaw said, clasping May's bare hands without hesitation. "Stood up to them bastards and won." "We all did it," May corrected. "I couldn't have—" "No." The older woman's voice was firm. "You stood first. That matters. Others can follow courage, but someone has to show it first." As the celebration continued, Callum watched May work through the crowd, shaking hands freely now, her long hidden touch finally offered without fear. He thought about the frightened woman who'd pulled down hate signs in silence, who'd worn gloves like armor against the world. That woman was gone, transformed by crisis into someone who could face down hired guns and corrupt judges without flinching. "She's something," Eddie said, appearing at Callum's elbow. The boy was grinning, caught up in the victory. "Ain't she?" "Yes," Callum agreed. "She is." Later, after the homesteaders had been fed and housed, after the stories had been told and retold, after the sun had set on Perdition Creek's day of victory, Callum found May sitting alone by the now open spring. She'd removed her shoes and had her feet in the water, like a child at a creek. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She patted the ground beside her. "It's your spring too, husband." He sat, not quite touching, but close enough to feel her warmth. "How does it feel winning?"
Strange, she admitted. I spent so long preparing for disaster that I'm not sure what to do with victory.
Maybe that's the next lesson, Callum suggested. Learning to live without the fear.
She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, he could see tears on her cheeks. I couldn't have done this alone. You know that, right when you came to town, when you stayed. She took a breath. You saved more than just the saloon. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he wiped the tears from her face with gentle fingers. You saved me too, from drifting, from running, from carrying my brother's ghost like a stone. They sat in comfortable silence, feet in the sacred water, hands finally clasped without fear or pretense. The spring gurgled its ancient song, and somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called. The town slept peaceful for the first time in weeks, and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges rebuilding, organizing the water distribution, healing the wounds left by violence. But tonight, there was just this two people by a spring, learning that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in the fighting, but in what came after. In the quiet moments when you could finally set down your weapons and just be. 6 months later, the quiet spring saloon stood transformed. The old sign had been replaced with a new one, painted in blues and greens that caught the desert light, where boards had been patched and walls scorched. Fresh paint gleamed. A wooden awning stretched across the front, providing shade for the benches where old-timers gathered to watch the world change. May stood at the new window, no gloves in sight, her wedding ring catching the morning sun. The fear that had lived in her shoulders for so long had finally loosened its grip, replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. "Water delivery's here," Eddie announced, bursting through the door with his usual energy. At 14, he'd grown 3 inches and his voice had started to crack, but his enthusiasm remained undimmed. "Mr. Peterson says the school garden's looking mighty fine thanks to our spring." "Tell him he's welcome," May said, turning from the window. "And remind him about the town meeting tonight. We're voting on the new well placement." The spring that had once been Perdition Creek's secret had become its salvation. Under May and Callum's management, water was distributed fairly throughout the town. The miners paid a fair rate for their operations. The railroad, under new management after Baird's disgrace, purchased what they needed at market price, and every family had access to clean water for drinking and washing. Callum entered from the back room, carrying lumber for the new shelves. His wedding ring bore the scratches of honest work, and there was sawdust in his hair. Marcus brought his nephew by. "Boy's looking for work. Thought maybe we could use another pair of hands with the expansion." May smiled. The expansion was Callum's project converting the old stable into a proper bathhouse where travelers could wash off the trail dust. It had been his idea, but the way he'd presented it to her as a partnership decision had warmed her more than any declaration of love could have. "If you think he's reliable," she said, "you've got a good eye for character." "Do I now?" He set down the lumber and crossed to her, something in his expression making her pulse quicken. "What did my eyes see when it looked at you?" "A woman hiding behind gloves and secrets," May said softly. "No." He reached out, taking her bare hands in his. "I saw a woman protecting something precious until the right moment to share it. There's a difference between hiding and waiting." The kiss was gentle, familiar now, but no less sweet for its familiarity. When they parted, May's cheeks were pink, and Eddie was making exaggerated gagging noises from the doorway. "Don't you have deliveries to run?" Callum asked, trying to look stern and failing. Yeah, Eddie grinned. "But Miss Grace asked me to tell you she'll be by after school for her piano lesson. Miss May." After the boy left, May moved to the piano, now tuned and polished to a warm glow. She'd been taking lessons from Mrs. Chen, who'd studied music in San Francisco before life led her to Perdition Creek. Her fingers, so long hidden, had proved surprisingly adept at finding melodies. "Play something,"
Callum requested, settling on the bench beside her. She thought for a moment, then began a simple version of Red River Valley. The notes rang clear in the morning air, and she heard Callum's breath catch. When she finished, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Tom would have loved this, he said quietly. Would have loved all of it. The town coming together, the water flowing free, the music coming back. He's part of it, May said, leaning into his shoulder. Every choice you made to stay and fight instead of drift, that's honoring him. They sat quietly for a moment. Then May asked, Do you ever regret it settling down? You were free before, could go wherever the wind took you. Callum considered this. I thought I was free, but looking back, I was just running in circles. Freedom isn't about having no ties, it's about choosing the right ones. The saloon door opened, bringing a wave of heat and the scent of desert sage. Mrs. Crenshaw entered, now a regular visitor since the Water Rights Association had established an office in Perdition Creek. Morning, you two. May, the photographer from Harper's Weekly, is here. They want to do that story about the town that fought the railroad and won. May sighed. There had been a steady stream of journalists since word got out about their victory. Send him in, but no sensationalizing. This is about community, not confrontation. As the morning progressed, the saloon filled with its usual mixed miners grabbing coffee before their shift, merchants discussing supply orders, mothers bringing children for the new lending library May had established in the corner. The quiet spring had become what May had always envisioned, not just a saloon, but a gathering place, a heart for the community. Sarah emerged from the kitchen with fresh bread, her daughter Grace helping to carry the tray. They'd stayed on after the attack. Sarah managing the food service while studying to become a teacher. The town was growing, and opportunities were blooming like desert flowers after rain. Mrs. Hayes, Grace said shyly. Can I practice on the piano before my lesson? Of course. Dear, you know you're always welcome to it. As the girl settled at the piano, picking out a careful melody, May looked around the room. Joe Prescott was regaling the photographer with his version of the standoff with Baird. Mrs. Chen was teaching young Marcus to calculate percentages for the water distribution. Eddie was back, helping Sarah serve the lunch crowd. Penny for your thoughts, Callum said, appearing at her elbow. Just thinking how different it all is. 6 months ago, I was alone, wearing gloves, keeping everyone at a distance. Now? She gestured at the bustling room. Now you're at the center of it all, where you belong. We're at the center, she corrected. Partners. Remember? He smiled, that slow smile that still made her heart skip. How could I forget you only remind me 3 times a day? Liar, it's at least 5. They were laughing when the door opened again, revealing a familiar, unwelcome face. Tommy Bracken, one of the ranch hands who'd tried to cause trouble that first night Callum had arrived. But his posture was different now, humble rather than aggressive. Mrs. Hayes, he said, hat in hand. Mr. Hayes, I wonder if I might have a word. May exchanged glances with Callum, then nodded. What can we do for you? Tommy. It's my sister. She's getting married next month, and she was hoping, that is, we were wondering if we could use the spring for the celebration. We'd pay fair, of course. It was an olive branch, May realized, a recognition of how things had changed. Tell your sister we'd be honored. The first wedding celebration at the spring should be special. Tommy's face lit up. Thank you, ma'am. And I'm sorry. For before, for the signs and the trouble. You've done right by this town. After he left, Callum shook his head in wonder. Never thought I'd see the day. People change, May said simply. When you give them reason to. As afternoon wore on, the saloon settled into its rhythm. The photographer captured scenes of ordinary life water being drawn from the spring. Children reading in the library corner. May and Callum working side by side, Not the sensational story he'd probably hoped for, but something better, the quiet triumph of a community that had chosen connection over conflict. When evening came, they closed early for the town meeting. The old church was packed. Voices raised in spirited debate about well placement, school expansion, and a dozen other signs of a town planning for a future rather than just surviving the present. May sat with Callum in the third row, her hand in his, no longer concerned about who saw or what they thought. Around them, the people of Perdition Creek, now informally known as Springtown, discussed and argued and laughed together. "Look at that," Callum murmured. "Baird's men threw bombs, and all they did was blow this town together instead of apart." May squeezed his hand. "Water finds its level. Maybe people do too, given the chance." As the meeting wound down and folks began heading home, May and Callum walked slowly back to the quiet spring. The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear desert air. From somewhere came the sound of a guitar and voices raised in song. They paused at the entrance to their saloon, their home, and May felt that familiar swell of gratitude for the spring that had brought them together, for the courage to remove her gloves, for the man beside her who'd chosen to stop drifting. "Happy?" Callum asked, reading her expression. "Happy?" she confirmed. "You?" He pulled her close, there in the doorway where anyone could see. "More than I ever thought possible." Inside, the spring gurgled its endless song, no longer hidden but flowing free, like May's hands, like Callum's heart, like the future of a town that had learned the power of standing together. The wooden sign above them creaked gently in the evening breeze. The quiet spring, all welcome. And in the desert darkness, with the water singing below and the stars burning above, two people who'd spent too long running from connection stood together, proof that sometimes the deepest wells were found not in the earth, but in the choice to stop hiding and let yourself be known. The dust had settled on Perdition Creek's transformation, but the spring flowed on, patient and eternal, offering its gift to all who came with open hands and honest hearts. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale from, whether you're driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere out in the western lands where stories like these were born. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's connect over our shared love of these frontier romances. If you enjoyed May and Callum's journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover these tales of courage, love, and redemption in the American frontier. Your support helps keep these stories alive for everyone who believes in the power of love to transform even the wildest of hearts.